Yeah, hi. This is probably the earliest talk I've ever given, so keep that in mind while judging my performance. So before I get started on the topic, I just want to introduce myself and to kind of frame what the rest of what I'm going to say. And what we do in my lab, most of the people in my lab work on is it falls under the coding. And the idea here, I'm going to give you we're interested in the senses of touch and proprioception. And I'm just going to use touch as an example. The idea is when you grasp an object or you manipulate an object, there's a pattern of deformation of the skin that produces a pattern of activation in the nerve, here denoted by these these colored rasters, and different colors correspond to different types of nerve fibers that respond to different aspects of these skin different deformations. And then this neural activity in the nerve then propagates down the neural axis, ultimately giving rise to a percept of this object. And when we hold an object in our hand, we have information about its shape, its size, its texture. If it's moving, we have information about that, and that's all coming from these signals from our hands. And so, what we're interested in my lab is to try to understand how is this information multiplexed in the nerve. So, all this information about the texture and the shape and all that stuff, it's the same neurons that are carrying it, and somehow we can disentangle these kinds of information stemming from the nerve, and as it propagates along the neural axis. And what we're interested in is coming up with quantitative models that relate not just the stimulus and the pattern of neural activation it evokes, but also how patterns of activation along the neural axis give rise to perception. So that's what we spend most of our time doing. And so our neuroprosthetics effort relevant to this conference consists of taking what we've learned from this, the code, touch and tactile and proprioceptive coding along the neural axis, and try to leverage that to develop ways to restore the senses of touch, and proprioception, where we focus on touch. My colleague coming up next works on proprioception. But we try to leverage what we've learned about how touch is encoded in the intact nervous system to try to restore it to patient populations who have lost it. So, for instance, amputees who have lost their hand, and so they're equipped with bionic hands, and we want to restore the sense of touch through these bionic hands via nerve interfaces, or tetraplegic patients, typically with a spinal cord injury, for whom peripheral nerve interfaces are not an option because they're no longer connected to the central nervous system. And for those subjects, we work on cortical interfaces. And I'll be talking mostly about peripheral nerve interfaces today, but just to kind of show you to show you the bridge to the upcoming cortical interfaces. Okay, so first, before we get into the neural engineering, you might ask yourself, why are we going to spend so much time and effort trying to restore the sense of touch? And this is a movie I made of me doing stuff with my hands, and most of it is very mundane stuff like picking things up, writing with the utensil. And the idea is that anytime we're doing anything with our hands, we have this barrage of sensory signals coming back from our hands that tell us about the hand state and about our interactions with objects. And without these sensory signals, we would struggle to do anything with our hands. And let me just show you, let me prove that to you. This is a movie made by my colleague Roland Johansson at Umeå University in Sweden, of a lady lighting a match, no problem. Moments later, the same lady is going to try to light this match, but her fingertips have been numbed with a local anesthetic, and you can see that suddenly she struggles mightily to do this task. She drops one, she realizes she's not going to be able to pick it up, and then after a long struggle, she manages to light it. But what's remarkable is that she's going to continue doing this for a while, and she's going to continue to be really bad at it. And that's because you just cannot restore, or you cannot compensate for the loss of these tactile signals with vision. And here's another case. This is an individual who suffers from a neuropathy that has destroyed his somatosensory system, or at least his somatosensory nerves. So he has an intact motor system, but he can't feel his body. He lacks the senses of touch and proprioception. And you can see he's doing something even easier than lighting a match. He's trying to grab this coffee cup and bring it to his mouth, and he struggles mightily to do even that. And if I showed you this movie and I asked you, what do you think is wrong with this person? You would think he has a severe motor impairment, and it really highlights the yin and the yang between the motor and the sensory systems, where really one does not work without the other. And therefore, in the context of prosthetics, if you want to create a prosthetic limb that is endowed with the dexterity that our limbs confer to us, you need not only to have a sweet robot and an awesome way to control this robot, but you also need to restore the sensory signals. So this is, just to kind of orient you, I'm sure most of you have seen stuff like this, but this is my colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh. So you can see there is a tetraplegic patient, Jan, who's controlling this robot by thought. And the idea is you read out signals using chronically implanted arrays from primary motor cortex, the part of the brain that sends signals to the muscles. And you can, from these signals, infer what the intended movement was, and then you can make the robot do whatever that intended movement was. And so to Jan, the way she experiences this is that she is trying to move her own arm, which is paralyzed, and she can get this robot to do whatever it is she wants. And if you're watching this, you're like, well, this is pretty cool. If you're watching this for the first time, it's a pretty great achievement. But now, if you're watching this for the 1,000th time, you'll probably think to yourself, well, you know what? I would be way better at this task than she is. But she's about as good as this gentleman I just showed you a minute ago would be doing this task, right? He struggles to do the coffee cup. He would struggle doing this grasp and transport task. So this highlights the fact that if you want to, it demonstrates that there's something missing without the senses of touch, because she can't feel anything. Now, a subsequent subject, Nathan Copeland. First, let me describe briefly how you would restore the sense of touch. So the idea is when you grasp or when you're contacting an object, the skin deforms. It activates nerve fibers in the skin that innervate the skin, and these signals travel up the arm, short distance up the spinal cord, ultimately culminate in a pattern of activation in somatosensory cortex. So this is the part of the brain that receives touch input from the body. And that pattern depends on what you touch and how you touch it. So these prosthetic arms or hands have sensors on them. And what we work on is to convert the output of these sensors into patterns of electrical stimulation of the brain to reproduce, to the extent possible, these natural patterns of activation, right? Or at least produce patterns of electrical stimulation that produce patterns of neural activation that are intuitive, that the subject can use to guide its manipulation with objects. So this idea now has been, and usually I spend a lot of time describing what happens up to this point, but I'm just going to tell you what the future holds instead. So this here is on the left side is the video that I showed you earlier, which is Jan moving these objects, and on the right side is a more recent subject at Pitt, Nathan Copeland, who's doing the same task, but the sensor output on the hand is converted in real time into electrical stimulation of somatosensory cortex, so that when he reaches to grasp an object and make contacts with the object, he actually can feel the object through the bionic hand. And I don't have the data here, but this stuff is published. So if you don't believe me, you can check it out. But Nathan does significantly better with the sensory feedback than without. So there's another condition comparing his performance when you just turn off the sensory feedback, and he's much slower at doing this task. And of course, as you would expect, when you're grasping an object and you can actually feel the object, like I showed you earlier, this confers a lot greater dexterity. But this is the Gen 1. And in these Generation 1 sensory encoding algorithms, and this is all of the sensory encoding algorithms that have ever been used in a cortical interface, consisted of taking the output of the sensors and then modulating the amplitude or frequency of stimulation of the brain, right? So you're just basically tracking the pressure on the sensor with your electrical stimulus. And what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about is, how we can do better than that, and how and what we expect to happen when we do. So I opened this talking about cortical interfaces, but what I'm, and the idea there is to have, to take the output of the sensor and produce patterns of electrical stimulation of the brain. But I'm going to talk now a bit about how to restore touch in amputees, and the reason why is because that that work is sort of more advanced than its cortical counterpart, and therefore can serve as this roadmap of what we expect to find in the brain-machine interface on the brain-machine interface side. So the idea here is with amputees, the nerve that used to innervate the hand is still intact. So what you can do is interface with that nerve. And when you electrically stimulate that nerve, you can produce this has been shown now many times, you can produce very vivid tactile sensations that are projected to the hand. So subjects feel something coming from the hand that they know is no longer there, and it's very vivid, and so you can use that phenomenon to restore touch. So this is my colleague Dustin Tyler at Case Western University, just to show you kind of the Gen 1 algorithms here, where again there are sensors on this hand that convey to him a sensation of touch that is modulated by how much pressure he's exerting on these very fragile objects, and you can see how remarkably well and accurately and precisely he can modulate his force, which he could not do without this tactile feedback. But so that was Gen 1, but I think a lot of progress has been made on the sensory encoding algorithms, and I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about that. So first, before I do, let's think about what are the neural correlates of natural touch. What happens when you're actually interacting with objects? Well, you have something like 12,000 nerve fibers that innervate the surface of the hand. And anytime you touch anything, all 12,000 of these nerve fibers are going to respond differently to that touch, depending on what type they are, where they are relative to the contact events, etc. And so you have 12,000 independent channels of information telling you what's going on when you interact with an object, and that's why the sense of touch is so rich and so useful when you're interacting with objects. Now, if you wanted to restore the sense of touch perfectly through a nerve interface, how would you do it, right? Well, what you would need is 12,000 stimulating channels, each selectively stimulating or activating a single nerve fiber. And then if you knew exactly how that nerve fiber would respond during an interaction with an object, you could just kind of electrically activate it to reproduce that natural pattern, right? And if you did that, you would restore touch perfectly. People would feel like, wow, this is natural touch. The unamputated hand and the amputated hand would basically feel the same. Of course, this is predicated upon technologies that don't exist and probably never will, upon sensor technologies that don't exist and probably never will. But this is kind of ideally, this is what you're shooting for. So while the technological component of that is just nowhere near there, the scientific bit, understanding the relationship between patterns of skin deformation and patterns of activation is. And so why are these slides here? Okay. And this is a model that we've been developed, that we published now in 2017, but this is the culmination of something like 20 plus years of work. And it's a model that what it does, in brief, again, this is published if you want to check out the details, but what it does is you specify a stimulus, and it describes how the skin would deform given that stimulus. And it tiles the skin with mechanoreceptors at their known densities. So there are multiple kinds. There's three main kinds of mechanoreceptors and mechanoreceptive afferents that innervate the palmar surface of the hand. So we innervate this virtual hand with all these nerve fibers at their known densities. And then we can predict, using a pretty simple model, it's an integrated fiber model, a pretty simple model, how each of these 12,000 nerve fibers would respond given this stimulus, given this pattern of stimulation of the skin, right? So what you on the input side, what you have is the stimulus. You just tell it what is the stimulus, and on the output side, it would say how all 12,000 of these nerve fibers would respond to that stimulus. And when you do that, again, this is just to show you that this model works. And so this is the rate predicted by the model versus the rate measured in real nerve fibers. And you can see that the model can predict very precisely how natural nerve fibers would respond, not just in their strength. So you can see these are really hug the unity line, but also in their timing. So if you know anything about mechanoreceptive afferents, you know that they respond in very precise ways. If you present the same stimulus over and over again, they will give you a very precisely identical response in time, right? And so what we show is that this model can reproduce with essentially millisecond precision the response of each of these nerve fibers. So now you have 12,000 nerve fibers, and you can reproduce with millisecond precision their responses to any stimulus that you can come up with. So let me just illustrate the sort of the model, show it to you in action. So here, for instance, you specify an indented edge into the skin. The blue or this surface here shows you how the skin would deform. There's a model of skin mechanics that shows how the skin would deform given the stimulus. And then on the right, it shows you how all 12,000 of these, the nerve fibers that innervate the fingertip would respond to this. So I don't show you the entire hand here. I just show you the fingertip. So for instance, you can see that RA and PC afferents only responded during the indentation and retraction phases, whereas the SAs respond throughout, et cetera. So it really gives you a detailed a representation of how all the nerve fibers would respond. Here's now an example of textures. When you scan textures across the skin in different directions, you can simulate how each of these nerve fibers respond to that. And I'll just mention in passing, before I go back to the neuroprosthetics, that this is a potentially very useful scientific tool, because now, instead of having to painstakingly respond or record from individual nerve fibers and create populations and then try to understand how information is encoded in these populations, you can just simulate, you just give it a stimulus, you simulate the response to that stimulus, and then you can see how the information about that stimulus is encoded. So I'll give you an example of a paper we published last year of how that can be really useful and save a lot of time. There was this idea actually by Roland Johansson, whose movie I showed you earlier, that so first, in touch, there was this long-standing idea that, when you grasp an object, the geometry of this object, the local geometry of this object is encoded in space, in the spatial pattern of activation, kind of like in the retina. When you look at an A, you get an A-shaped pattern of activation in your photoreceptors. Well, if you press your finger across an embossed A, you get an A-shaped pattern of activation in these mechanoreceptive afferents. And the idea is that's how information about local geometry is encoded in the nerve. But so this was the old idea, right? Now Roland made a great point that when you're interacting with objects, you need to really have this tactile information rapidly. You can't just wait 200 milliseconds to figure out what the shape of something is. And he suggested that this spatial idea did not work because it's too slow. You have to kind of integrate over time. But what we were able to show, but this was basically a theoretical idea, right? Because no one has ever recorded from every single nerve fiber in the nerve. But what we did is simulate the responses of every nerve fiber in the nerve. And what we found is that in fact, the spatial information evolves very quickly. So for instance, this is showing how quickly can you figure out what the orientation of an edge indented in the skin from these patterns of neural activation. And we showed that you can do that within like 30 or 40 milliseconds. So very, very quickly, and much quicker than you might have thought if you were, if you listened to Roland, who suggested that you had to integrate this information over time. And the reason why is because you integrate over space. When you have so many densely packed receptors, actually that information evolves much faster than you would have thought. And this is something that we were able to discover and show with this simulation. Okay, now back to the prosthetics. So again, in a perfect world, we would have the model that takes the output of sensors and converts them into pattern of activation of the nerve to really reproduce touch in all its glory. But the reality is, we have a few sensors on the hand, and we have only a handful of stimulating channels, maybe up to 100 if you're really generous, but that's still orders of magnitude fewer than there are nerve fibers in the nerves innervating the palmar surface of the hand. So my student Lisa Okorokova and Shinpu He and I developed a way to sort of create a simplified model of how the nerve responds. Rather than trying to reproduce each nerve fiber's activity individually, what we wanted to see is how do populations of nerve fibers respond to stimulation of the skin. And that, when you're stimulating, you're not stimulating a nerve fiber at a time. You're stimulating a population of, let's say, hundreds of nerve fibers. And so what we want to do is simulate how these hundreds of nerve fibers respond so that we can control, or we can know how to stimulate these populations, at the level of fascicle. So first, what we showed is that we developed a very simple model that has that it's a linear model with a handful of parameters, and it can reproduce the aggregate activity that is simulated using the full model very accurately. So here, the black. So this is just during activities of daily living with a sensorized glove. You can see the force traces in these colored traces up here, and then the black is the full model. How well can you predict the responses, the nerve responses using the full model? And the colored traces are how well can you estimate or approximate that full response at the population level using the simple model. And you can see it's very, very well. It's well enough, right? And so then this approach has now been deployed with actual subjects, where again, you use this model that I just showed you to take the output of the sensors and convert them into patterns of electrical stimulation of the nerve. And when you do that, a bunch of cool stuff happens. One, the stimuli the stimulation feels more natural, right? So you compare a flat train that is typically used to these biomimetic trains, and they feel more natural. That's shown here. This was published in Sylvester Macher's lab in 2018. But they also confer greater dexterity on you. And I'm showing you one example, and this is the fragile object transport task, where you're just trying to transport a bunch of fragile objects without breaking them. And you can do better with these biomimetic trains than you can with just the standard trains. So it's not just that you're better with the touch than without. You're better with this biomimetic touch than with the standard touch, which just tracks the pressure. So that's promising, because what that means is when you're speaking the nervous system's natural language, when you're given the central nervous system the signals that it expects given interactions with objects, things feel better, feel more natural, and the resulting sensory feedback it confers greater dexterity, right? Another thing so the second image here, although Sylvester also showed that you're better at the fragile object task, but in this case you can also, for instance, perceive the compliance of objects better with this biomimetic feedback than without. So it just gives you more information about the objects, more information about the contact events, and it feels more natural. So the reason I went through all this kind of side story about peripheral nerve interfaces at a BCI meeting is because we published another paper this year or last, I forget, where we looked at contact events during in the nerve and in the brain. And we found that at the aggregate level, at the population level, the nerve activity mimics the brain activity. So the same exact model can be used for sensory feedback in the nerve than in the brain. Looks like I'm out of time, so I'll just mention one last thing. I was going to say some cautionary notes. Just to kind of link it more to the general tenor of this meeting. So here we're talking about restoration of touch, and maybe a lot of you don't care about restoration of touch, but the sorts of approaches that we're using to stimulate the brain to try to reproduce natural patterns of activation, basically what we're doing is writing information into the brain through electrical stimulation that is interpretable, right? And so once as we improve our ability to do that, you can start expanding the scope of that. So you can, maybe write in different kinds of sensory information, or writing memories, or writing any kind of thought. So the long horizon, sort of the Neuralink, Elon Musk's horizon of this kind of work is to learn how to better directly write information to the brain. This is my lab, and sorry, I went a little over.